Welcome, my name is Mark Treadwell and this is the second in a series of video clips that support the resource Learning How the Brain Learns. And so the focus here really is around getting some definition around some of the terminology we use. So first of all, I'd like to start with some of the very basic terminology around things like knowledge and ideas and concepts, etc., which we talk about a lot. We often refer to those when we're talking about our lessons and what needs to be learned and how the learner is learning those things. But what do they actually mean? How do we define them? So let's start with knowledge, because that's at the foundation point of our learning. And basically, knowledge is defined as a sequence of sensory data from your 23 senses that we have as human beings that is then interpreted and remembered as facts or information. So, for example, we might read somewhere that London is the capital of England, and we remember that as a fact. Now, we might have to repeat that a number of times before we actually remember it, but for long term, that is. But if we do that, we gradually start building together a library of factual information. Okay? And it's often acquired by learning we call by rote sometimes, or repetitive learning, or off by heart. So knowledge is a sequence of sensory data, and we remember that information. Ideas are defined as a relationship between two variables or two things, processes that are changing. And so we might look out the window one day and notice that one of the trees outside is losing its leaves. And we then sort of relate that loss of leaves to the fact that, oh, well, this is autumn. And so we have an idea that that tree loses its leaves in autumn. It doesn't mean every tree loses its leaves in autumn, just that one. So ideas are very context orientated. Okay? So we can learn it for that tree. That tree in that window, therefore, will probably lose its leaves again in another year's time, next autumn. But it doesn't help us predict another tree out of another window or another tree in a forest somewhere. In order to move away from understanding the idea to understanding a concept, we need to actually experiment with that idea in different contexts. So that was one context, that tree out the window. But then we need to look at other trees. And in looking at other trees, we start to realize that some trees lose their leaves all the time. Okay, so they every year lose their leaves, so they're deciduous trees. And then we've got evergreen trees, which actually are green across the whole 12 months, and they don't lose their leaves. So what we need is extra information. So we had an idea, but now we need to go and get more knowledge. We need to build that knowledge base so we can actually start to realize the difference between a deciduous tree and an evergreen tree. Once we've got that, we then apply it to different contexts, and we gradually start to realize just by looking at a tree whether or not that tree will lose its leaves in autumn or not. So we get a concept of which trees lose their leaves within autumn and which trees will keep their leaves through the autumn. So in a concept we've got variables, things that change, processes that change. We've got one is that the tree losing its leaves, and the second that happens in autumn. So these two variables combine together to form a concept, and we can start then predicting any tree once we have sufficient knowledge and experience across a number of different contexts. We can then take that concept and start marrying it together with other concepts to form a concept framework. For example, in driving, we've got the concept of steering, the concept of braking, the concept of roundabouts, the concept of getting off and on a motorway, etc. There are lots of different concepts. There's also ideas that we have as well about what to do in certain situations, in certain contexts. And then we have some knowledge. For example, we need to know that the speed limit is 60 kilometres an hour. That means you can't travel over that speed. We know the speed in local environments is either 50 or 60 kilometres an hour. On the open road, the speeds will be higher, so we know the speed limit. It's very precise and defined. So concept frameworks are a mixture of interlinked networks of variables that are dependent on each other, and they include concepts, ideas, as well as knowledge. So concept frameworks are what we operate in most of the time. Then we need to often talk about imagination. Now, imagination is quite a tricky one to define exactly. But imagination is essentially the process whereby our brain combines our knowledge, our ideas and our concepts in unique ways to come up with sort of those creative outcomes. But those creative outcomes don't necessarily need to have value outside of our own minds. And by that I mean, for example, that in our imagination we can fly, which is fantastic. It's a great sort of sensation when you can actually imagine yourself flying. But it's not very good in a practical sense. It's not that we can actually go and do that, but we can imagine that. Creativity is slightly different. Creativity is the end result of our imagination coming up with new ideas, new concepts and new concept frameworks that actually have a value outside of our own mind. Okay? So it's outside of our own mind. Imagination is contained within. Creativity is actually something that happens outside of our mind. And creativity allows us to come up with new concepts, concept frameworks, ideas, and even new knowledge. Innovation is different again. And in innovation, we're actually coming up with new ideas and concepts or concept frameworks that have the potential to become new products, systems, or environments that may or may not have been created before. Okay? That's the good idea. If you actually turn that innovative idea, or concept framework, into a practical outcome, that's called ingenuity. So ingenuity is taking the innovative idea and turning it into a product, a system, and an environment in a practical sense. So that's our beginning. We've got some words we know and we can start to understand and apply those words appropriately when we talk about is the child building some knowledge, is the adult got a new idea in the workplace so we can actually work on this concept or another concept or a concept framework. So learning is about making sure we're precise. So if we want to actually be a profession called education and involved in that profession called education, we need to be quite precise about the language, just like medical doctors need to, as engineers need to, teachers, learners, educators, all need to have that precision as well. Now, education is a creative process. Learning is a creative process. And creativity is absolutely critical. And we know when kids first come into school, as young learners, they're very imaginative. They're very creative. But over time they can lose that passion and their belief and their confidence that they can be creative. And research has been shown that, in fact, as we age, our ability or our confidence in ourselves to be creative and innovative and come up with new ideas and new concepts, etc., diminishes. And as educators, one of the critical things you must do is encourage and build that confidence in their ability to be creative. So from a learning perspective, we also want to talk about curiosity, because curiosity is quite difficult to define as well. It's not a feeling or an emotion, but actually it's a passionate sensation that drives us to want to learn. Okay? It drives us to want to learn. And curiosity is incredibly powerful, as we'll see when we start looking at the learning process later on. In fact, when I think about it, there's a couple of young boys I interviewed a couple of years ago now, and they had a wonderful quote. They said to me, he said, "Mr. Treadwell," he said, "in the learning process, there's a different attitude to being stuck. If you're stuck, it's an okay thing. You're not failing. So when we're stuck, we call ourselves something we call being in the pit. Okay, so when we're in that pit, when we're stuck like that, it can be a bit like, a bit tricky, a bit hard and sort of frustrating sometimes, and you might want to give up. But we have a set of tools which gives us the clarity around how to get out of the pit." And it was fantastic for these 11 and 12-year-olds to describe how important the learning process is to getting out of the pit. Not that the pit's a bad thing, but it's exciting to get out of the pit and suddenly go, yes, we've got it, we now understand. In order to build understanding, it's very important that we have a sense of our inner voice, a sense of our own person. And that takes time. And it's not something we just suddenly get one day. It's something we develop over time. But as educators, we need to encourage that inner voice. The child reflecting on their own self. Why do I think that? Where did that come from? Where did that new idea come from? could I combine that idea with another idea? So thinking about our own thinking, that reflective notion, is really important and it's really powerful, and we need to be very explicit with teaching that and encouraging that in our classrooms. And this is often referred to our notion of consciousness. We have a conscious sense of ourselves. Okay? And one of our biggest challenges through life, even as adults, is to have a sense of self. Okay? Now, the learning process, which we'll unpack later on in more detail, is based loosely on the inquiry process. So inquiry is really a subset of the learning process. The learning process, as we'll see later on, is a much bigger set of processes, and inquiry is part of that. Okay? So what we want to do in this session also very briefly is just introduce you to some of the structures inside the brain that we will be looking at. And your brain is basically two hemispheres with a series of structures that sit in the middle and sort of underneath the brain. And the two hemispheres that would make up the cortex of the brain is where a lot of thinking happens, etc. But also we've got other structures such as the amygdala and hippocampus that help us actually link things together. They help you associate my voice with my image. Because you could associate my image with a vacuum cleaner, making a noise. How do we differentiate? How does the brain do that? Associate the right voice with the right image, the right person. Because your ears don't act as echolocators. Okay? So the brain actually does that, and the amygdala and hippocampus are critical to do that. There's another small organ right in the middle of the brain too called the gyrus. And the gyrus contains stem cells, and these stem cells allow the brain to change its structure as we age. In particular, in our first 24 to 28 years of living on the planet, our brain changes dramatically. And it changes dramatically from a brain dominated by neurons to being dominated by another type of cell called the astrocytes. And so we go from having a brain that's almost 90% neurons when we're young and first born, to a brain that actually has about 7% of neurons when we're in our late 20s, early 30s, and our number of astrocytes, the percentage of astrocytes in our brain, goes from being very, very small when we're first born to being 76% once we're in our mid to late 20s, early 30s. So your brain is changing dramatically, and the gyrus is where that change happens, that contains the stem cells that can be downloaded, so to speak, and used to make sense of our world. So that's a brief summary of the first two chapters. Now you might want to go away and have a read of those chapters now to pack out some more detail, and then we'll come back and have a look at the next video clip. So thank you very much, and we'll return soon with another video clip of the next few chapters. Thank you.